Awesome. Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Everybody's energetic? Excited? I'm really happy to be back at Streamline. This is a fun event to do. Unfortunately, this is not one of those presentations that is overwhelmingly entertaining. It's a little bit more technical than that, so we might as well dive right in and see if we can't put you to sleep. My name is George Williams. I'm the founder and CEO of a small company called Reliability X. We're a niche consulting firm that if you actually want to improve reliability, we're the people that'll help you do that. A little bit about my background. I've a master's degree in maintenance and reliability engineering from Monash University. Originally a partnership with the University of Tennessee, but blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I ended up with that. CMRP, CRL, all the fun acronyms, all that wonderfulness. I spent 15 years in pharmaceuticals at Bristol Myers Squibb Pharmaceuticals. I started out there, believe it or not, as a painter. My first job there was as a painter. 15 years later, I was responsible for asset management globally for them. Left there, went to a company called B. Braun Medical Devices. Spent 3 years there and realized we were not a cultural fit. They, on paper, wanted to improve, but not in reality. And so left there and finally convinced my wife to start a business. 6 months later, COVID hit. And so on the I told you so's. So let's get into what we're talking about today, which is how to build a strategy for an asset. First, let's go through a couple of definitions. We have to understand what maintenance is and what maintenance is not. When I often present to teams, I ask them to write down what the definition of maintenance is, maintenance teams. And more often than not, we get 30 different responses. And how does an organization move forward as one if they can't even define who they are at the base? Maintenance at its heart means to guard or protect. It means to stop from failure, to protect the asset and the asset's integrity. So we have to preserve it from failure. What maintenance is not is firefighting. That's not the act of maintenance, that's the act of correction. You're gonna love tomorrow's keynote, by the way. From a terminology perspective, we've got all kinds of fun stuff we're gonna talk about today. This is the exciting stuff about maintenance. We're gonna talk about potential failures and failure modes and functions and failure modes and effects and all kinds of boring crap that gets us down to what do we do to an asset. Typically what happens is engineering drops assets off in your plant. Hopefully they even give you a manual with it. That's a maybe. And then someone transcribes the owner's manual into EAM, and that becomes the strategy for the asset. This is a common scenario. Unfortunately, it's a horrible way to derive a maintenance strategy. How many folks, did anybody drive here today? Is anybody driving? We have a couple people that drove. Okay. Did you walk around your vehicle this morning?
To get the stuff out from our wife.
Did you check the left blinker?
Nope.
The right blinker? Did you check all the fluid levels? Well, the owner's manual tells you to do that each and every time before you drive the vehicle, so why didn't you do it? I didn't read it.
Well, it's impractical to do it every time you get caught.
Well, it either is the right strategy for the asset or it's not, right? And in your head, you did what's called a risk prioritization. You have determined it is unnecessary for me to check the left blinker because you have what's called detectability. Inside the cabin, if the left blinker is out, it will blink faster. So as an operator, you have detectability. You didn't check the tire pressure because now you have a dummy light inside the cabin that tells you your tire pressure's low. The design of the vehicle, the asset itself, has reduced its risk priority number for certain activities. And in your head, whether you knew it or not, you walked through the logic that exists inside EAM in the RCM section. So we're going to walk through some of this terminology together and hopefully understand it a little better. I'm not going to read. You guys can, everybody can read? Yep. Great. I am far from a read the slides person, which is sometimes a downfall. Well, let's look a little bit about some of this failure mode and failure types. 3 types of failures to be familiar with. The potential failure. A potential failure means a component on the asset is going to fail, but it has not catastrophically done so yet. If I get some water inside my bearings, because I'm in a food manufacturing plant and we pressure wash the bearings every night, and we aim specifically to get the water into the bearing, we have a potential failure. We then have actual functional failure. This is when the component can no longer perform its intended function. And this can be catastrophic or not catastrophic. If I have a pump where the impeller wears to a significant enough place that I can no longer pump the specific GPM at the right pressure, then I have a functional failure even though the pump has not died. You then have a catastrophic event. This is when the bearing blows apart, the shaft gets scored, the pillow block gets a nice oval in it, and we're replacing a bunch of parts. The strategy from a maintenance perspective is to avoid the catastrophic event and hopefully avoid what causes the potential failures. Doug Plunknut's PF curve is one of the best ways to see this. This PF interval, or time it takes from the potential failure until the catastrophic event, is what we're trying to manage as a maintenance organization. Can we stop a bearing from ever failing? No. It will fail. What we can do as a maintenance organization is give it the longest life possible, A, and B, know far enough in advance to have a minimal impact to the operation. Will the impact be 0? No. We're going to have some time that we have to replace the bearing. But we want to have the minimal impact to the operation. When is it most convenient for us to swap it out? So, how does equipment fail? Because it's physically unable to do what it's supposed to do, or because in some cases we cause it. Sometimes it's a human intervention that causes a failure. And so when we develop a maintenance strategy, we are trying to do the minimal amount of intrusive maintenance. This is why we use things like predictive technologies and why we use things like ultrasound and vibration analysis and infrared thermography. Those technologies do not stop a failure from occurring. What they do is buy you time. Time to appropriately plan the work when it is least impactful to the organization. Oftentimes, this degradation can be trended over time, and we can have a rough idea of that PF interval. How long will it take to become catastrophic, relatively speaking? Knowing that time window allows you to determine frequency of execution of tasks. So, we can derive or guess what the frequency is, whether it is meter-based or time-based, both handled well within EAM. But that interval is based on what's the point from potential failure until a catastrophic event. Obviously, we need to inspect or take task interventions in a shorter frequency than that interval. If it's longer, then we could miss the incident. So the actual time of failure depends on when the cause and coincidence of the failure happens. This point in time can be, is when we can no longer operate the asset effectively. And our maintenance strategy is designed to prevent that issue. So how do we get to that point? Let's explain it very clearly. What you're looking at on the screen is what's called the bathtub curve. The bathtub curve was derived from a study, the RCM study from Nolan and Heap in the late 1970s. And what they found were that components fell in 3 major patterns. It was a bunch of patterns, but when you put them together, there's 3. On the left-hand side is infant mortality. This is when a component does not burn in. It doesn't even last its warranty period. This is electronic components that weren't bench tested, things that weren't installed properly, things that were manufactured the day after the Super Bowl, all that stuff. On the far right, we have age-related wear out. This is stuff that was built right around World War II. Otherwise, this is a unicorn. Everything in between is known as the random event pattern. The reason it's random is because if I take 2 pumps, identical, install them next to each other and run them the exact number of hours, they will not fail at the same moment for the same failure mode. That makes failure modes, generally speaking, random events. When an asset is designed, it has a base condition baked into it, a designed-in reliability. I can buy a Toyota Corolla or a Ford F-150. They have a completely different expectation of reliability and cost to operate and maintain. And it is baked into their design. You do not get to choose it later. Because of this, we derive a maintenance strategy. Let's say we use the OEM recommendations. And so every morning we check the lights and we restore back to base condition if we find an issue. This happens in your plant every day. This is your maintenance strategy. An asset deteriorates, maintenance shows up, replaces a belt, restores it back to base condition. Asset deteriorates, maintenance shows up and lubricates it, restores it back to base condition. This is the role of guard and protect. There are certain components on your assets that are called wear components. They are designed to wear, to protect the asset. Maintenance's role is to manage those wear components. The inverse of this is the cost of the asset. And so as an asset deteriorates and friction builds up in a bearing, I have to use more energy to turn the motor. When I restore back to base condition, I also restore back to base operating cost. Now, we utilize techniques such as design for reliability to change where that base condition sits. For example, we can use motor bases that are 2 pieces of all thread and it takes forever to get them aligned. Or we can buy the motor bases with 2 sets of rails and a single adjusting bolt. They have a different cost to the maintenance organization based on how long it takes to maintain that asset. We can buy cheap motors or we can buy good company motors. Just like we can buy the Toyota Corolla versus the F-150. We utilize techniques like reliability-centered maintenance, or FMEAs, or the functionality inside EAM around RCM, to alter this pattern. How does this happen? Great question. This happens because I'm no longer doing tasks I should not be doing And my frequencies are based on the actual failure mode. What does that mean? Great question. Let's say it's an air handler. How many folks have air handlers in your plant, right? Like it's simple asset. We'll use simple stuff that everybody has. The PM says, the PM frequency today is probably driven by the lubrication requirement, so you have a quarterly PM. And somehow, while I'm there, I'm checking damper linkages that foul once every 10 years. And I'm inspecting things that don't foul, that I have no history of a failure of. But because I'm there, I'm doing a bunch of other stuff. The logic you'll go through when evaluating risk priority number will get rid of things you should not do and give you a more appropriate strategy, thus changing the deterioration rate because I'm less human intervention, and changing the overall cost to operate and maintain the asset. Now, eventually, I'm still going to have this potential failure, this point in failure time, where I contaminate the bearing. I get a speck of dirt, somebody doesn't clean off a grease gun, something. We utilize those predictive technologies to assess for these conditions. Whether it's machine learning, NAI, or infrared thermography, vibration, and all those other technologies, we are assessing condition long before your senses can sense it. The reason we do that is for maximum planning time. Should we use our senses, we're more likely to have the catastrophic event. And when we use our senses, we're often rush ordering parts. So I can utilize what EAM has built in, utilize the predictive technologies, utilize the machine learning capabilities, and know in a large enough window to appropriately plan the activity, or I can let nature take its course. It is, but it's also why your costs are high. Because not only am I replacing the bearing, but I scored the shaft and I have to replace the shaft, I have to replace the pillow block, maybe I damaged the fan. So the idea of we can't afford to do that, but we can keep affording to rush order parts and replace 5 things instead of 1 is nonsense. So how does this work? Luckily, there's a standard and I don't have to reinvent the wheel here. SAE JA1011 is the standard for RCM. There's also JA1012, which is the application of it. And basically what it's going to do is ask a series of questions. What are the functions of an asset? As an example, the functions of a pump are to displace a medium at a specific GPM and pressure. The secondary function of a pump is to not leak unless it has a packing gland, and then it's leak at a specific drip rate. So I've got 2 major functions. That is, well, how can an asset fail to perform those functions? I can have a motor failure, I can have impeller wear, I can have all kinds of things. What are the failure modes associated with that? Causes, consequence to a failure. We'll talk a little bit about some of those. We're not going to get into a lot of detail because I only have an hour. And then what can we do to either predict or eliminate the failure mode from happening? And if we can't do that, what other intervention can we do? So let's look at that, how it's structured. Whether it's an FMEA or an RCM, it's pretty much the same thing, just to a slightly different detail level. We've got functions, functional failures, failure modes, effects, consequences. And then we derive this risk priority number. We'll talk about that in just a second. And the entire goal is to reduce that risk priority number. That's all baked into EAM. How many folks are using that functionality inside EAM today? Outstanding. This all starts with first understanding what is an asset. This is often where folks struggle. What does or does not go in the system? What constitutes an asset record? That should be well defined inside the organization. Otherwise, we end up with a bunch of stuff you'll never write a work order to. Right. Or the other way around, finance dictates it, and the only thing you have is everything you spent more than $5,000 on. So we have to define what an asset is. For me, there's some general questions to ask. I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, but do I replace parts on it, or do I throw it out and replace the whole thing? That's first and foremost. If I throw it out, it's not an asset, it's a spare part. The second question I ask is it a major component located someplace else? So if I have a split air system, I want to know that there's a coil outside of somewhere on the roof, just because the location's different. Next question is, am I required to track its calibration? Calibrated instruments, you don't usually replace parts on those things, but if you're governed by some regulatory agency that requires you to track the calibrations, then they're assets too. Next question is, do we collect predictive maintenance data on it? Why is that a separate question? Well, because I want to build the route, and so I want route stops. And I'm kind of indifferent to if you build these out as actual assets or you make them just locations, but somewhere I need to be able to build out a route that says I stop here. Next question is it independent and considered a financial capital asset, so a transformer? I'm not going to have a PM strategy. I'm certainly not replacing parts on the transformer, but I paid 10 grand for it, and so it's an asset. And then if all those are no's, guess what? It's a spare part. Now, this is just a general rule of thumb. This is a starting point, right? So you make changes to this based on your organization and what your organization wants to track, but we developed this just to be a starting point. So in a scenario like this, where I've got an air handler and coils, and I've got temperature readings, and I've got localized dampers, VAV boxes inside certain rooms, whether or not it's an asset or not, should go through some decision logic. Just because it's on the P&ID doesn't make it an asset. And you may have assets that are not specifically listed on the P&ID because they're part of some other system. In scenarios like this, I would say the VFD, if you replace the boards and it has filters that need to be PM'd, then the VFD is an asset. If this is in a clean suite and you have to calibrate the temperature signals, then that's an asset too. But if not, they're not an asset. I may repair the coil, but I don't need that to be that's not an asset. When it's dead, I throw it out and put a new one in. I'm not replacing parts on it. So having a good definition helps us to move along where we need to be. So the next step is to understand criticality of the parts, of all those assets we put in. And right baked in to EAM is the ability to not only give a score, but to build the questions that will derive the score. How many folks have their criticality analysis built into EAM as a series of questions? Outstanding. We have to understand severity and business risk, and that's different for everybody. So the reason EAM allows you to build it is because that's different for every organization. You can't stand up here on the stage and say, well, it's severe if it costs more than $1 million in a failure. Well, that's great if you're a gigantic company, but things are critical at 10 grand at some companies. Other severity categorizations that exist: environmental, quality, safety. You can even have other things sitting in there for occurrence. How often is it likely to occur? What's its operating context? Do I need it 24/7, 365? Does it have redundancy? Is it an N+1 scenario? All of those things help derive the critical nature of the asset. Why do we need to know whether or not the asset is critical when building out a maintenance strategy? Because one of the components to determine should I reduce the risk priority number using some technology or not is the cost to do it. Just because I can do something doesn't mean I should. If it's a non-critical asset, my PM strategy should be run to failure, put some spare parts in the storeroom. It should not be go collect a bunch of predictive data that costs a lot. And so we calculate risk with severity and occurrence. These are just example criteria that sit in a deck because if you download the deck, you'll have them. We're not going to read through this. And your organization will have to develop their own criteria and scoring mechanism. That matrix can be built directly into EAM, which is fantastic functionality because most systems just say, well, tell me what you did in some Excel file someplace. Let's go through this really quick. Functions of an asset. If we have an air handler, it is designed to move a specific amount of volume and may have to do so at a certain temperature and a certain humidity level. Lots and lots of functions exist. The first step is to understand all the functions of the asset. Inside EAM, this gets built on the equipment template record when using the RCM logic. We then have functional failures, which basically just means it doesn't do the functions. We then move on to failure modes. How are we going to not move air? Well, we can have lots of reasons we don't move the air. The motor could fail. I could have a belt failure. I can have a closed damper. I could have clogged filters. Many, many reasons why I'm not moving the appropriate amount of air. They're all failure modes. The failure effects describe what would happen if no task is done. If I don't do anything, what is the effect of I'm not moving enough air? It could be I have to close down the theater. If I'm not moving air, we're not allowed to use the space. It could be I have product that's stored in here that needs to be at a certain temperature and I lose the product. Why do we need to know the effects? Well, we're about to put together a maintenance strategy to mitigate this effect. We need to know what its cost is. What would it cost if we have to evacuate the theater? What would it cost if the product in the room went bad? The consequence side of things is more on the safety side. So from a consequence perspective, this deals with safety or environmental. And so we list those out separately. We then have to get down to a risk priority number. Whew. That risk priority number is based on 3 categories. The first being severity. What's the severity of this failure mode? And that varies. It's not asset-based, it's component-based. For example, what's the severity difference between my left blinker is out and my brakes don't work? It's the same asset, it's a car. Completely different severities for different failure modes. If I have a pump, the motor failure has a different severity than impeller wear. If the impeller wears, the VFD ramps up and I can still move product. If the motor fails, I'm not moving anything. Different severities. The second category is called occurrence. And occurrence looks at how often, either did this occur? If you have data in the AM, you use the actual data. If not, you have to take an educated guess. The third entity here is detectability. Will an operator know it immediately? Some failure modes are hidden, and so their detectability is extremely high, meaning, well, it's an inverse score for detectability. A high score means you have no detectability. Emergency lights. They're all over the place. They're a hidden failure mode. That means you're not testing to see if they work. You're actually testing to see if they have already failed. There's no way to know it will work when you need it. It's not possible. And so you're testing e-stops, same thing. You're testing to see if they have already failed, not that they work. You may have caused it to fail by running the test. And the next time someone hits it, it's not going to work. That makes it a hidden failure mode. So detectability is about whether or not the operator is going to know. And now inside my vehicle, I know my tire pressure. And so the automotive industry has made my detectability score lower and lowered my risk priority number. And so now I don't have to check my tire pressures. This is calculated typically as a product score, and you end up with a risk priority number. The goal of building a maintenance strategy is to reduce the risk priority number. It's that simple. Failure modes that have a high risk priority number, you attempt to lower it. So we sort those failure modes by the highest RPN number and decide where the line in the sand is. This is always a point of contention for people that execute this. There's no, this is the line in the sand. You have to use common sense. When you start getting down to failure modes you know you should not be addressing, that's the line in the sand. Don't do anything below it. So we've got a couple of different ways to mitigate a failure mode. The first way that we should attempt to eliminate a failure mode is to engineer it out. This is called a one-time change. It's an unscheduled activity, meaning it doesn't happen at some frequency. You're going to do it once. You can engineer out the failure mode so it doesn't happen anymore. If you are unable to engineer it out, the first scheduled approach is to assess its condition. Assessing condition can happen two ways, through technology or physically. You assess the condition of the asset. If we can't do that, then we have potentially a scheduled discard. A scheduled discard is appropriate to things that have a failure pattern that's consistent. My belts usually last 2 years. If that's the case and you know that emphatically, then you can just schedule a PM every 2 years to throw the belts out and put new ones in. If you do not have a consistent failure pattern, then you need an inspection to inspect the belts and an on-condition task to replace them. NASCAR does an awful lot of scheduled discards. They run a certain number of laps, and after those laps, those parts disappear and they put new parts on. They don't wait for the part to fail. They know I can't do another 400 laps with this part, and because of that, I get rid of it because I'm inside the PF curve. They don't want to take the risk, and so they replace the part. That's called a scheduled discard. Failure finding tasks, again, are check the e-stops, emergency transfer switches, generators. They're all failure finding tasks. A scheduled restoration is if I'm going to strip a piece of equipment down and rebuild it at a certain interval. This is often popular, but not based on it being derived by RCM logic. Companies will we do annual shutdowns, so we're ripping all of our equipment down to nothing and rebuilding it, and then they have 3 weeks of ramp up because they can't figure out how to get it back together right. And then, of course, you have run to failure. Run to failure is an adequate strategy. Sometimes it's not worth doing the maintenance work. And that's really contextual. That's based on what the asset is doing and the value proposition of the asset for your organization. When I lived in Philadelphia, Philadelphia has an awful lot of radiant heat hot water systems for houses, right? So we've got a little B&G 100 or a little Taco, little square pump that circulates hot water through the radiators. That thing's critical in the winter. But that same pump in your plant is run to failure. It's the same pump. The critical nature of it is what is it doing for the organization? So again, one-time change is engineering modification. On-condition task, I hate the terminology here. It's the terminology from the standard, but in my opinion, you are assessing condition. This is not an on-condition task. The on-condition task is when I find the bad condition and do a replacement. Once I have inspected it, either through technology or physically, and assess its condition to be bad, and I replace it, that's an on-condition task. Based on the condition, I replaced it. Scheduled discard, replacing filters, your oil change. You're doing a scheduled discard when you do your oil change at a specific number of miles. Scheduled restoration, this is a complete overhaul. Failure finding task is for hidden failure modes. All of these factors sit inside EAM, except run to failure. Although you can identify as run to failure, you're just not going to create a strategy around it. There's no mitigate. The mitigation strategy essentially is don't do anything. The end goal is to reduce the risk priority number. If I have a motor that can fail because of lack of lubrication, using precision maintenance techniques reduces the risk priority number. At the end of all that, I've got a bunch of different failure modes I have to address, but sometimes at different intervals. Some of them are going to be based on cycles and meter based, and some of them are going to be time based. And some of them we're just going to we're going to put them on the route for predictive maintenance, or we're going to put it on the lubrication route. So no longer will you have just, we have 1 PM and it comes out every quarter. We're all struggling to find resources. One of the ways you can get some free resources back is to not do things you shouldn't be doing. So we sit down and do our scheduled tasks and our on-condition tasks, and we do a cost-benefit analysis. Should I do the task or not? Is it worth doing the task? One of the good reasons to do this is it gives you an argument for zero-based budgeting. How many folks had to reduce their maintenance budget this year? Nobody? Wow, that's amazing. That's usually a standard, or you just get the same budget. But it's based on somebody's arbitrary belief of what your budget should be.
And then they say, well, can't you cut it 5%?
Right, cut it 5%. Based on what logic? This puts the logic behind what it will cost to maintain this equipment. It's through a recognized engineering standard. I know it's hard to push back on your leadership team, but they have no qualification to determine what you should spend on maintenance. None. They're unqualified to tell you your budget. You'll learn this tomorrow, but the asset just doesn't care. It doesn't care what you want to spend. One correction on here, thanks to some conversations earlier today, you can unlock the failure mode on the work order in EAM. Now, when I was doing my research for the presentation, I didn't see that field, and so I was asking a question about closing codes versus failure modes. And you can actually unlock the failure mode mechanism on the work order. Why is that important? Great question. At the task level, you have designed a task to mitigate a specific failure. If you are populating the failure mode on the work order, I can now run analytics to tell me if my strategy works or doesn't work. If I am seeing failures in the field but have no mitigation strategy for it, then I need to do a root cause analysis in the system, get a failure mode identified, build the strategy differently, and then redeploy. It also would allow you to run a report that says, well, which mitigation tasks do I have where I never see a problem for that failure mode? Because maybe the frequencies can be stretched. Maybe we're doing the task too often. And so we should revisit that as well. That analytical capability is off the chart. This is how you continually get better. If you are not taking advantage of the functionality that exists to build the strategy using what is already capable inside EAM, then shame on us, because it's phenomenal. It has the ability to not only develop the strategy, but to deploy the strategy and then monitor against the strategy. And allow you to document the continuous improvement loop and make this a fluid strategy that can change with the organization. What happens when a new production line comes in and the line you've already done the RCM study on is no longer that critical at the plant? Well, this is pretty easy to solution now if we're using the right tools inside EAM. I can easily modify the criticality and update my mitigation strategy across whole sections of the plant. Boy, that's it. Thank God. Sorry, it's a more technical presentation than I normally like to give, but it's not a bad topic. And quite honestly, I've seen throughout history folks not take advantage of functionality inside systems. This is a piece of functionality that I would highly recommend you take advantage of. Just in the brief time that I did some research on it, it is fully capable of developing your strategy. And this is how your strategy should be developed. All right, questions? I think Alex is going to come down with a microphone at some point in time. Yes, sir.
We were talking about cost. It's something I fight with my procurement folks all the time about. There's a constant talk about cost, we shouldn't talk about that. And we're talking about buying parts, buying critical spares, things of that nature. Analyzing or assessing, yeah, this one might be half the price, but it lasts, it lasts 30% of the time. So, you're really adding value to the organization. So that's something that I constantly fight with, changing the culture of cost versus value.
Right, so the question was cost versus value, right? the organization is going to buy subpar. Procurement has a goal. So first and foremost, let's address the cost issue. Name a company that went into business to be the best at cutting cost. So how can it be an organizational objective? The objective is profitability. If you go to www.insertyourcompanynamehere.com/about us, cutting cost is not listed. Being profitable is, quality is, the environment is, safety is. Cutting cost is not. Cutting cost is a misinterpretation of profitability. So if you're a procurement and someone tells you to cut cost, what are you going to do? I buy substandard equipment and parts, or I negotiate new corrugate at a cheaper rate, which makes me the lowest important supply vendor, to the vendor that they have. They could care less about my complaints because their profit margin for me is terrible. So I get substandard customer service, and I deserve it. In EAM, you can track and monitor the life of those parts and do a study. Tell them for this asset, I'm going to buy this one. For this asset, I'm going to buy this one. And let 5 years go by. Are you okay, sir?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Yeah, no worries. So you let 5 years go by and then compare. What was the reality? Don't give them the argument. Their arbitrary decisions mean nothing. We have to start pushing back against arbitrary decisions. They're completely unqualified to tell you what value is inside an asset.
And that's kind of the cultural change I'm trying to make. When I first got there about 5 years ago, the leader of procurement, his line was, people in the field want a Cadillac, we need a Chevy. I'm like, well, you shouldn't be making that decision. It's not your decision to make. So if you're a partner in running this organization, you're not a sheriff.
Right.
So I constantly, slowly but surely changing that culture of, being business partners versus, being sheriff.
I would run studies on how often those substandard parts fail and figure out what the cost of that asset failure is and sum it up.
The failure isn't the only consideration, right? Going with the cheap part, maybe adding costs.
Yes.
As you mentioned earlier on, when equipment runs, it may be pulling energy more than it should.
That's right.
And if you're actually using that inferior part, it's not necessarily that it's failing, but it's costing you more. And you may not be tracking that value of the energy consumption that goes through it. This is something that we do as well, is take energy consumption into consideration and start to go through. But it's a good point to go into that, is it really, when you save costs, if you're not tracking all costs, you know. Yeah.
And it's not always easy to get to because you have day job. I get it. But
But the heavy lift is more the cultural change of the thought process.
it is.
Of being partners versus being, once again, sheriff versus, guarding the store.
Yeah, when they buy substandard corrugate and the plant is shutting down every minute for 30 seconds because they have a box jam, somehow no one associates that to procurement. Any other questions?
Yes. Oh, wow, that was super loud. So via the app, thank you, Travis Dixon asked, how do you describe the difference between the use of an asset's criticality value and RPN?
The criticality value of the asset is the asset as a whole. The RPN number is down to the failure mode, which is typically tied to a component. So the risk priority number is associated to an individualized failure mechanism, whereas the criticality of an asset is based on its value to the business in its current location.
Thank you.
Welcome. Anything else?
I don't see any on the app right now. We've got about 5-ish minutes before we break for the next session. So if there's anybody else that wants to ask a question, I can pass the mic around.
Awesome. Thanks for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you, George.